Welcome to PA Timber Goose. Today is May 30th. Happy Memorial Day to all the veterans. It's very warm today. As you can tell, I have a lot of road noise in the back. Hopefully that won't get too loud. I'm actually sitting very close to the road, and the grandparents on both sides are roughly born around 1890, just before the beginning of the 19th century. And basically they had no refrigeration, no running water, and no electric, no vehicles. All their cooking was done on some type of an old cook stove. Generally wood was used most of the time for the fuel. My chair is slowly sinking. Going down. Let me move my chair here a little bit. Here we go. Put some feet on the bottom of my chair. Saw another YouTuber do this, and I only have one left on the bottom. Ground is kind of soft here. Let's put these back on my chair. It'll cool off here in the shade. I almost forgot where this spot was. I had to walk back and forth a few times, so I figured out where it was again. There's a rock back here. Let me put my chair on this rock. Let's see if I sink it over here. That's a little better. There was a corn snake sticking out of here in the sun when I came by, but I couldn't get the camera together fast enough to catch him. Corn snakes are very beautiful, and I haven't seen one of those in a while. Okay, what was it like being a homesteader? Pretty much everything you ate was made for that day. You had no type of storage or refrigeration. Most of your food was cooked on the old cook stove that you see in the old movies. Generally they fed the cook stoves wood. Where did most of your meat come from? Generally most of your meat was fresh, or it was smoked or cured somehow. A lot of meals were sliced bacon or some kind of dried pork. It was salted and dried, or it was smoked. Grandfather made a smoker out of an old outhouse one time, and my mom never forgot that. Apparently it must have worked. You could smoke an entire pig inside of that outhouse. The outhouse would be here, and then there would be like a small chimney coming down, and the fire pit, it was at the bottom. So the smoke, you could actually control how much smoke was going through your smoker by opening and closing the vents. So the smoke would be at the fire pit in the bottom. It would go up through the smokehouse, and it would go out through the slots or the holes in the top. That was their smokehouse. You could also can meat. You could salt it, cure it, and you could cook it in mason jars and seal it that way. That was another way to go. So you always had fresh eggs. If you were a homesteader, you always had chickens, so you had fresh eggs. Say if you lived between 1890 and 1940, there were a lot of food shortages. World War I broke out around 1914, and there was a food shortage during the whole time. Sometimes you could only eat meat once a week. Everything was greatly rationed, and then we had Wall Street crash, and that created another food shortage, and then we had the Dust Bowl in the back end of that. So roughly we had about 30 or 40 years of a food shortage. A lot of times you could only eat twice a day. My mom remembers those sometimes. She said a lot of times there wasn't a lot to eat. When did refrigeration become available? The first residential refrigerator was available in 1927, and by 1945 a lot of households had a refrigerator and an ice box. The old ice box was a short, wide refrigerator, and you opened the door and it had a little tiny freezer inside of it. The freezer on the other side kind of looked like the ice box. It was an upright freezer. But the refrigerator is called an ice box because before that they were using an ice box, which basically was some kind of a cabinet with metal or wood, and it had a block of ice on the bottom that was cut in the winter time. And every week they would come by, a horse and buggy, and they would take a big block of ice out of there with your tongs, and they would stick it in the bottom of the refrigerator. So that was your ice box. Other places to keep your food and your milk and your eggs cool. A lot of farms had a spring house but not everybody had one of those. Spring house generally was a masonry building with a metal or tin roof, and you could store your milk and eggs in there, and some of your meats you could keep cool for a short time. It would never get below freezing in the winter. In the summer it would hover between 45 and 50 degrees. Option 2 was the root cellar. The root cellar is generally where you stored your apples and pears and your fruits, your potatoes, and all the vegetables that you canned from your garden. They were stored in there, and that was pretty much like a spring house. That would average about 35 degrees in the winter. In the summer it could hover around 45 or 50 degrees, so that was basically an underground storage place. That's how the homesteaders stored their food. And sometimes if the tornado came, you could hide in that root cellar for safety if your house had no basement. A lot of the old houses had a dirt floor in the basement and had the big beams going across with the low ceilings, and they were always fun exploring in the basements. Grandparents, some of the houses they rented, they always would rent the old farmhouses, and I would always explore the basement. Look at the big beams. A lot of times the beams are only flat on the top and the bottom. The sides were still round. And they usually had a big coal stove in the basement. You had to keep stoking the coal stove. That furnace would keep the whole house warm if you didn't have a wood stove. Very beautiful in here. Birds are singing away. What kind of food did homesteaders grow in their garden? Homesteaders generally had a very large garden. You had to grow most of your food for the entire year. The biggest crops were usually potatoes. They would last 6 or 7 months out of the year. They usually stored very well in their root cellar. Tomatoes were another one that was a big part of their diet. Tomatoes and peppers and onions, watermelons, cantaloupe, large corn patches were also part of their diet. Potatoes could get you through most of the year, and my mom's family, they were basically what they would call a meat and potatoes family. They ate meat most of the time and potatoes, but on the side they had other vegetables. Breakfast usually consisted of bacon and eggs, or some kind of salted meat, toast on the side, sometimes some scrapple. Cornbread was usually also on the side, or cornmeal. Fried cornmeal was mush. My dad used to eat a lot of that. None of us would try that, but that's how they grew up, eating that type of meal. Cornbread was very common. Another breakfast staple was toast soup. Basically, you would cook your toast till it was real crunchy. Get some cold milk in a bowl and crunch your toast up in there. Bugs are getting hungry. You would crunch your toast up in that milk and make a thick soup out of that, and that was toast soup. I know my friend at work, his dad, when they grew up, they had 14 kids, and he said a lot of times they would have coffee and soup. That was their version of toast soup. Lots of cars going up and down that road. I'm so close to the road it feels like they can see me, but they can't unless they stop and look through the woods. I'm very well concealed in the bushes here. Okay, that was meal number 1. Meal number 2 usually consisted of lunch, some kind of sandwich or leftovers, homemade biscuits with preserves that you made from your garden, or jelly on cornbread. That was usually your lunch or snack before dinner. Supper was always cooked on a wood stove, and it usually took a while. You can imagine how hot it was in that kitchen, burning a wood stove indoors, and it was already 100 degrees outside. A lot of people had outdoor kitchens, and that would be the reason why. It would usually take an hour or more to cook chicken, and usually it was some kind of a pot roast with vegetables in it, or some kind of pot pie with a gravy on it. Chicken pot pie was very popular. Chicken pot pie was boiled chicken, and you would make a broth from the chicken broth and cooked dough in the middle of it. Sometimes that had vegetables in it. That's still a very popular meal. Or you could have a chicken pie or a meat pie, which basically was corned beef, cooked with potatoes and a crust and some onion in there. That's always very tasty. I haven't had that for a while. So that's what your meals basically were. Tomato gravy was always my dad's favorite. Basically, he would make some toast, and his mom would make tomato gravy from fresh tomatoes in the garden. And basically, it was like creamed beef over toast, but it was a vegetable instead of the meat. A lot of times they didn't have meat, but tomatoes are very plentiful, and they would eat that over top of toast. One of my dad's favorite were always turnips. Nobody in the family would eat turnips, but a lot of people ate the turnips. They were very easy to grow with the potato crop. They were prepared like mashed potatoes, and you put some butter and salt and pepper on them. And the potatoes were always a side dish, and so were turnips. And cornbread were grits. Corn and potatoes always accompanied pretty much everything you ate. Basically everything that you grew in your garden got canned as they kept coming in. And they got put up for the winter in the spring, and that had to carry you into the next year till the next crop came. Fruit trees were always common. You could have standard fruit trees, semi-dwarf fruit trees, or fruit trees. My grandfather always grafted his own dwarf fruit trees. Basically what they would do is they would take a set of roots off from another tree, and they would graft a fruit tree on top of it, and they would wrap it, and it would grow together. So less pruning, and you had fruit on a faster time scale. Generally you would have fruit off the dwarf trees from 2 to 5 years. Semi-dwarf would grow a little bigger, and they would get about 10 to 12 feet, and they would produce a much larger crop. Standard fruit trees can take 5 to 15 years, but you'll have a much larger crop. Apples were always the most popular fruit. They were the easiest to grow, and generally they were cooked in applesauce and canned. Apple pies, apple turnovers, apple fritters, fresh apples. That was a big staple of the time. Another fruit tree would be a few more fruit trees would be pears and peaches. They were very common. Very common staple in dessert. For the old timers, canned peaches or canned pears. The third staple of the homesteaders would be wild game. The third staple of the homesteaders would always be wild game. Rabbits were very high on the list. There was a lot of rabbits available. Most of the rabbits couldn't be harvested till you had a first frost, and it would kill a lot of the fleas and ticks on the rabbits. And a lot of the wild game, they do have parasites. So after the first killer frost, then rabbit pot-pie would become part of the menu. And I always wondered how many rabbits and wild birds my mom's parents ate and my dad's parents ate. I know my dad growing up, they ate a lot of rabbit pot-pie. It wasn't uncommon for them to come back with 8 or 10 rabbits between two of them, and that would feed 5 or 6 people. Generally that was made in a rabbit pot-pie, maybe with a potato on the side or some potatoes mixed with it. That was a pretty hearty meal and would stay with you. With some canned peaches or pears for dessert. My dad said his dad shot so many rabbits with his old double barrel. The end of a shotgun kept cracking, so he would keep sawing it off as they were going. The old double barrels usually had a 30-inch barrel on them, and they would keep sawing them off as it cracked. The old shotguns had very brittle barrels, and they could never withstand the heavy loads in the newer shotguns today, but rabbits are fairly easy to take out. My dad used a borrowed single-shot 410 from his uncle, and the ejector was broken so they would never come out. He had a pair of pliers in his pocket, and as he would shoot and harvest a game, he had to open the shotgun up, get the pliers, pull the shell out, put another round in there, and keep going. Lots of wild game on the table, lots of deer along the way too. Venison was also a very big staple, and today we have many more deer than we did back then. Deer were shot very randomly. In some areas there were no deer. They were almost harvested to the point of extinction in some areas. Deer season was closed at one time, and they actually trapped deer and brought them into Pennsylvania in the northern tiers and let them come back. That's how bad the deer population was shot out. Another family story I was told. My uncle said he was hungry and Mom said there was nothing in the refrigerator. She said, if you boys want to eat, you got to go out and find something to eat. And I'll make you some Popeye out of whatever you bring home. I'm assuming it was summertime, so they jumped in the car. And they were riding the back roads looking for some runaway chickens. Chickens have a habit of wandering away into the neighbor's yard and fields looking for something to eat. So they were driving down the back road, and there were some chickens running across the road. They got out and chased them down. Killed them, put them in the back seat, and took them home. Unfortunately, they became dinner for the family for that night. They were turned into some chicken pot pie. And times are tough back then. You never knew if you had food to eat or where it was coming from. So you had to be very resourceful with your gardens and processing and curing your meat. Canned food, I believe, came out in the early 40s. So you could go to the local store and you could buy canned meat, which usually was Spam, canned beans. Beans were a very big staple, along with your canned and salted meat. Cornbread on the side, and your homemade bread and rolls. Alright, thanks for coming along today. Hopefully you enjoyed a look into our family history, voices from the past, and some family stories. How the homesteader survived. Do we have the skills to survive if we had a food shortage today? I'm sure a lot of us would starve. We would have to go back to the old ways of the homesteaders of growing. We would have to go into the ways of the past, and we would have to grow our own chickens and cows and pigs to survive, and we would have to process whatever came out of our garden, along with our micro fruit orchards, which would usually be apple trees, pears, and peaches, and basically go back to living off the land. Thanks for coming along today. Thanks for watching PA Timber Ghost. Smash that like button, hit the subscribe button. It always helps the channel. And comments are always welcome. Let me hear some of the stories of how your family survived in the past, in the 20s and 30s, and did they grow their own food or did they buy it? Alright, we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching PA Timber Ghost. We'll see you in the next video.